Thank you, Daryl, and thank you all so much for being here today. This panel really could not be more perfectly timed. We're about a month out from the target date of reaching a comprehensive deal with Iran, November 24th, and we just wrapped up a round of talks last week between Iran and the P5+1, where both sides really expressed their intention to try and reach a deal by that target date. However, as we know, there are still a lot of issues in those talks that remain to be resolved. Iran and the P5+1 have still not reached an agreement on the uranium enrichment capacity and the sanctions relief, amongst other issues. So I think today's panel will allow for a very sort of vibrant and timely debate sort of about this issue. So I'm going to introduce all of our speakers today at the onset and then allow them to come up and give their remarks from the podium, and then we'll have a question and answer session at the end. So first up is Robert Einhorn, who will speak on the status of the negotiations and key issues that remain to be resolved within the talks. Bob is a senior fellow at the Arms Control and Nonproliferation Initiative and the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence at the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. Prior to joining Brookings in 2013, he served as the U.S. Department of State Special Advisor for Nonproliferation and Arms Control, where he has played a key role in the formulation and execution of U.S. policy toward Iran. Following Bob will be Alireza Nader. Ali is the Senior International Policy Analyst at the RAND Corporation, where his research has focused on Iran's political internal dynamics and the elite decision-making. He is also the author of Iran After the Bomb. Ali will share with us his insights about how the internal dynamics of Iran are shaping the negotiations. And to close out the panel, we will have Elizabeth Rosenberg. Liz is a senior fellow and director of the Energy, Environment, and Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. And prior to joining the center, she served as a senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes, and an advisor to the Undersecretary of the Treasury for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. Liz will share her views on the sanctions regime and how that impacts the negotiations. So, Bob, I will now turn the podium over to you.
Kelsey, thank you. Thank you very much. Daryl, thanks for inviting me, and congratulations to the Arms Control Association for 42 years of excellent work in this field. As Kelsey mentioned, we're at a crucial stage. We seem always to be at a crucial stage in these Iran negotiations. Last week, there were intensive talks in Vienna involving experts, P5+1 political directors, at the ministerial level, Secretary Kerry, High Representative Cathy Ashton of the EU, and Javad Zarif, Foreign Minister of Iran, spent 6 hours together without aides present, but not much to show for this intensive interaction, not much progress. Later this week in Vienna, experts of the P5+1 will meet again within 2 or 3 weeks. There'll be another meeting at the ministerial level, a trilateral meeting involving Kerry, Ashton, and Zarif. But when they meet, there'll be probably less than 3 weeks left before the November 24th deadline for this extended interim arrangement. So it's clear, I think, at this point, as Kelsey mentioned, that we're at a serious impasse in the negotiations. Unlike when I was involved in these negotiations, at this point, all parties really want to reach agreement. When I was involved, it was clear to me, at least, that the Iranian team under Saeed Jalili wasn't truly interested in getting an agreement. This team really is. All parties in the process are involved. They're heavily invested. They recognize that the alternatives to a negotiated solution to this problem are quite unpalatable. So, they're committed. They want to get a deal, but they remain pretty far apart. The key problem is that you have one central issue, one bottleneck and a number of important but secondary or tertiary issues. And until this central issue is resolved, these other issues are really in a kind of holding pattern. Nothing new is happening on these secondary and tertiary issues. The central issue, of course, Kelsey identified it, is the question of uranium enrichment capacity, the amount of capacity in enrichment that Iran will be able to retain during the life of the agreement. The Iranian position is that there should be no reductions in current operational enrichment capacity. It has around 9,400 first-generation centrifuges enriching uranium. It doesn't want any reductions in that capability. It also says it wants to be able by 2021 to have the capability to provide fuel for the Russian-supplied Bushehr power reactor. But supplying that fuel indigenously by Iran would take roughly 10 times more centrifuge capability than Iran currently has operational. Why 2021? It's because that is when the Russia-Iran fuel supply contract for Bushehr expires, and Iran says it must have the capability to take over from the Russians at that point. But in order to ramp up to that capability by 2021, there needs to be a very short agreement. Iran has to be free of all constraints in order to build up to this capability. So it wants a rather short agreement. It's talked about 5 years, perhaps even between 5 and 10 years. So the main elements of Iran's position are no reductions in existing operational enrichment capability and a short duration agreement. The U.S. has a very different approach, which is supported in various degrees by its partners in the P5+1 talks. The key U.S. objective on the enrichment issue is to increase the so-called breakout time, the time it would take Iran to acquire enough highly enriched uranium for a single nuclear bomb if it decided to break out of an agreement. And this would, to lengthen this breakout time, it wants to do two things: reduce Iran's operational enrichment capability, the number and type of centrifuges, and also reduce the amount of enriched uranium stocks that Iran can keep on its territory. Also, the U.S. view is that if Iran truly wants to demonstrate its peaceful intent, it needs to keep these constraints in place for a long period of time to build confidence in the international community. And so it favors an agreement of anywhere from 15 to 20 years. So the U.S. position is deep cuts in existing enrichment capability down to its current position is 1,500 first-generation centrifuges compared to the existing 9,400. It wants to reduce the current stocks of enriched uranium to perhaps several hundred kilograms of low-enriched uranium, and it wants a long-duration agreement. So the gap is pretty wide. I believe the U.S. team has some flexibility, especially on the 1,500. I think it's prepared to increase the number. I don't know how far, but I believe they are prepared to increase it. But the problem is that at least so far, the Iranian side has been quite rigid, just simply hasn't budged on this question of not reducing current enrichment capacity. Now, why are they taking such a rigid position? I think there are a number of possible explanations. One is perhaps it's an Iranian bargaining tactic. Perhaps at the last minute they're prepared to reduce from 9,400 to 8,000 or something like that, and hope the U.S. will go for it. I don't know. I think if they believe that a very modest reduction will do the job, I think they're wrong. Another explanation is that perhaps they believe the U.S. needs Iran on regional issues, especially needs Iran to help defeat ISIS. And in order to get Iranian cooperation, it would be prepared to make concessions on the nuclear issue. I think that's also an illusion. Sure, the U.S. would like Iran to pitch in on ISIS, but I don't believe the United States is prepared to make concessions it would not otherwise make in order to buy Iran's cooperation on ISIS. And incidentally, Iran has its own motivation for wanting to defeat ISIS. It doesn't need to negotiate with the United States over it. There are those, another explanation is that there are those in Iran who believe that the Iranian economy is not doing, not doing too bad. That even with the sanctions in place, they could muddle through. Inflation is down. Perhaps they don't need an agreement at all. Why should they make major concessions in order to get a deal? Another explanation, which I think is quite valid, is that Rouhani and his team are quite boxed in by domestic opposition. There's strong support, the strong opposition, rather, to a deal, and a strongly ideological approach against negotiating with the West, reaching an accommodation with the West. So he faces, Rouhani and Zarif and company face very strong domestic opposition. And of course, I believe there are those in Iran that truly want to keep open the nuclear weapons option. I don't believe, and the U.S. intelligence community doesn't believe, that Iran's leaders have yet taken the decision actually to build nuclear weapons. But I strongly believe that there are those in Iran that want to keep that option open for the future. And the shorter the breakout time, and the more robust the enrichment capability they have, the more realizable the option is to go for nuclear weapons. And I think that's one reason the Iranians are very reluctant to compromise. So, but whatever the explanation, the Iranians are taking a very tough position, at least so far. But in addition to this major issue of enrichment capability, there are a bunch of other issues. They're also important. A lot of progress has been made on some of them, but they haven't yet been resolved. And I'll just tick them off very quickly. On this Arak heavy water reactor that I believe the Iranians began constructing in order to have a plutonium option to acquire nuclear weapons. There's been a lot of progress. The Iranians have agreed to redesign the reactor so as to reduce the amount of plutonium that's generated in the spent fuel. There's still disagreements over whether this should be a heavy water moderated or a light water moderated reactor. I think this is on its way to being resolved, but it's not yet resolved. On this Fordo enrichment facility, this previously covert facility that I believe was intended to be part of an Iranian nuclear weapons program but was detected by Western intelligence agencies, I think there's agreement that there won't be any enrichment taking place at that underground facility, that it will be repurposed. There'll be maybe research and development or something like that. But the issue of the disposition of the centrifuge cascades already installed there is not yet resolved. On the question of enriched uranium stockpiles, I think there's been a lot of progress. I think the Iranians seem prepared to reduce quite significantly the amount of enriched uranium they retain on their territory, but the quantities and the forms of the enriched uranium are not yet resolved. The question of what do you do with excess centrifuges? You know, there'll be some level that will be set. What happens to all those above that level? I think there seems to be agreement that those excess centrifuges don't actually have to be removed from their current locations, but they have to be disabled, so that would take a substantial period of time to restore them to operation. But the specifics of how fundamentally you disable those machines, not yet resolved. On monitoring of any deal, there's agreement that at a minimum, Iran will accept the IAEA additional protocol, and there's some indications that in certain instances they will go beyond the additional protocol to more intrusive monitoring. But those additional measures will depend on what kind of deal is reached on the enrichment issue. You know, for example, depending on what constraints are reached on research and development on advanced centrifuges, this will depend on what kind of additional monitoring you need. So this is an issue still to be resolved in the future. On sanctions, there's agreement that all nuclear-related sanctions will eventually be removed. Initially, the U.S. Unilateral sanctions will be suspended and they can be suspended by the authority of the U.S. executive. Eventually, they will be lifted, and they would have to be lifted by acts of the U.S. Congress, but that will be a few years down the road after Congress develops some confidence that Iran is truly in compliance. But an issue has arisen regarding the UN Security Council sanctions, which have very strong symbolic implications for the Iranians. They would like to see those gone as well. But those Security Council sanctions deal largely with the question of Iran's procurement of all kinds of goods and technology that could be used in Iran's nuclear and missile programs. And the U.S., understandably, is not anxious to see those removed at an early stage. Another issue, ballistic missiles. The Security Council Resolution 1929 talks about constraints on Iran's ballistic missile program. Iran is adamant that it doesn't want a nuclear agreement to deal with its missile program, which it says is strictly for conventional military purposes. The U.S. says that somehow the deal has to address this problem. No resolution on this. And finally, the question of Iran's past activities that the IAEA believes were related to the development of nuclear weapons, the so-called PMD, or possible military dimensions issue. The IAEA has been investigating this with Iran since late 2011 with very little progress. There was some hope that the Rouhani administration would be more forthcoming. It really hasn't been at this point. And until Iran is more transparent about some of these past activities, it's hard to see how an agreement will be achieved. So what's the outlook? In terms of getting a comprehensive deal by November 24th, I think the probability is very near zero. I would say it's zero. There cannot possibly be a full agreement. So what are the options? One option is simply to throw in the towel, call it quits on November 24th. I don't believe anyone, any of the parties in the negotiations would like to do that. They're heavily invested in this process, and I think they would be loath simply to end the negotiations on November 24th. I think they will find a basis to extend the talks beyond the 24th, but it's important on what basis they extend them. The best basis would be for them to have reached agreement on the key elements of the Iranian enrichment issue, even if not in great detail, but a cluster of issues having to do with having to do with the number and type of centrifuges, stockpiles, duration of the agreement, research and development on advanced centrifuges. If they reached agreement on a cluster of these issues, I think they would have a strong case to justify taking several more months to reach a final deal. But that may or may not be possible. In my view, it would make sense simply to continue the current interim arrangement, even if they hadn't managed to reach agreement on the central elements by November 24th. I think the reality is that last year's joint plan of action, the interim deal, is very much advantageous for the United States. The sanctions on Iran remain in place despite the modest improvement in the Iranian economy. The sanctions remain effective. The nuclear freeze has remained effective. The IAEA certifies that Iran has complied with its requirements. So I think the continuation of the current arrangement would be very much in the U.S. interest, whether or not agreement can be reached on the central elements of the enrichment issue. But I think if you didn't have agreement on those central elements, I think Congress would be more inclined to want to impose new sanctions. And the imposition of new sanctions by the Congress could seriously complicate the negotiations. The Iranians have said this would be intolerable and this would essentially end the negotiations. Don't know if they're bluffing or not, but I think this could raise a serious problem. So one way or another, I think there will be an extension. Whether, even with an extension, what are the prospects for a final deal? Well, about a year ago, President Obama said his sense was that there was a 50-50 chance of reaching a deal. I think that's still about right. But I think it's going to be difficult, and it's going to take some hard political decisions, especially on the part of Iran. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. Ali?
Good morning. Thanks for the Arms Control Association for inviting me this morning. I'm just going to briefly talk about what Iran may be thinking when it comes to these negotiations. Bob described what he sees as Iran's rigid position on the nuclear negotiations. And I would agree, I think Iran is pursuing a rigid position. I would describe it as a maximalist position on the nuclear issue. The Supreme Leader's office just released another infographic laying out Iran's red lines on the nuclear program. And when we look at what Ayatollah Khamenei, the Supreme Leader, has said, and some of the positions coming from his office, it doesn't really look like Iran is flexible on the issue. That looking at Iran's position, it appears that Iran wants to make a deal that really serves its interests. For example, Khamenei has said that not only Iran will not reduce the number of centrifuges, but it wants the option to increase the number to 100,000. So what's behind Iran's thinking? I think there are a couple of explanations. The number one explanation is that Iran remains flexible behind the scenes, but is presenting a very tough stance in the negotiations. And this makes sense to a certain extent. You don't want to really give up anything until very close to the negotiations in order to get the best deal. And basically, Iran is trying to get the best deal possible. It knows it has to be flexible at some point, but maybe right now is not the precise time for that. Another possibility, and I think there's increasing evidence that this is Iran's thinking on the issue, is that Iran overestimates its leverage for a number of reasons. When Hassan Rouhani was elected as Iran's president in June 2013, a lot of ways Iran was on the brink. The economy was in terrible condition. The country faced deep internal divisions from the 2009 presidential election. A lot of Iranians thought that The presidency of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad had been a very huge disaster for the country. Iran was isolated, divided at home, and Rouhani was elected to fix Iran's problems. And you can make the argument that since his election, since the signing of the Joint Plan of Action in November 2013, things have improved in Iran, that Iran is no longer on the brink, that the Islamic Republic no longer faces an existential crisis. The Iranian economy is better. It has not improved in a vast manner, but some of the indications are positive. Inflation is down from a high of 45%, or maybe even higher before Rouhani was elected, to 20-something%. The psychological mood among the business community in Iran has improved. Not that business is any easier to do in Iran, but people are more hopeful. There's a better management team in position under Rouhani, a more technocratic team that has a good understanding of economics in general, which is something the Ahmadinejad government lacked. Subsidies have been cut. One of the major reasons inflation was high was not just due to sanctions, but the tens of billions of dollars the Ahmadinejad government and previous governments were spending on subsidies. So the economy has improved somewhat. And also, there's this thinking in Tehran that Iran's regional and international position has improved quite significantly, especially within the last several months. And this is really due to the rise of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. A lot of Iranian officials now see Iran in a very advantageous position because Iran is very influential in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and throughout the Middle East, and has very close ties to the Baghdad central government, the same government the United States is working with to defeat the Islamic State. So Iranian officials, especially within the Rouhani administration, believe that the United States needs Iran, and not just the United States, but really the international community. And when we look at these negotiations, Iran is counting on support from the international community as well to help in these negotiations. I would argue that if this is the case, that if the Iranian government thinks its economy is improving and its regional position has improved, and that this will help it in nuclear negotiations, it is making a serious miscalculation, and it is seriously overestimating its leverage. When it comes to the way the international community views Iran, if the talks fail and the two sides break up, let's say, I think it's very unlikely that the international community will blame the United States. It's more likely that all members of the P5+1 and the rest of the world will blame Iran for a rigid nuclear position, and in effect, this will not allow Iran to undermine the sanctions regime if the talks fail. So if Iran believes that it can undermine the sanctions regime, it is mistaken. And this not really only applies to the Western members of the P5+1, but China and Russia as well. I was in China a couple of weeks ago, and the Chinese are on board with the P5+1 strategy. They don't want a nuclear-armed Iran. They have enforced sanctions to a large extent, and they're on board. So if the Rouhani government thinks that it can turn to Russia and China to alleviate pressure, I think it is mistaken. And when you look at the sanctions regime, and Elizabeth will talk about this, individual companies are complying with sanctions. So even if the Chinese government and the Russian government in the future come out and say they oppose sanctions, and let's say they blame the United States for the talks falling apart, individual companies and business people all over the world will still be very hesitant to deal with Iran in a significant way. On the issue of ISIS, there's been a lot of argument that Iran is a natural partner for the United States, that the United States needs Iran to defeat ISIS and other Sunni jihadi groups. But I would make the argument that Iran is actually part of the problem in Iraq, that Iran is supporting sectarian Shia parties that are contributing to the rise of groups like ISIS and leading to greater Sunni dissatisfaction. Of course, I wouldn't blame Iran for everything happening. I think there are a number of other factors. But looking at the issue in very black and white terms, that we need Iran to fight the Sunni jihadis, I think is a little simplistic. Because the policies being pursued by Tehran contradict the U.S. approach to the issue. The United States wants an all-inclusive, non-sectarian government in Iraq. It doesn't want the rise of Shia militias to combat ISIS, the same Shia militias that were conducting attacks against U.S. troops only a few years ago. So working with Iran on the issue of ISIS is problematic. I think overall it would make U.S. Arab allies and Israel very nervous, and it would actually complicate the nuclear negotiations. And politically in Washington, I think it would be very difficult for the Obama administration to be seen as working with Iran on the issue. If there is a nuclear deal, I think there is potential for Iran and U.S. cooperation on a number of regional issues that could still be problematic, but I think that's best left to the period following a potential nuclear deal between Iran and the P5+1. Finally, if the nuclear talks break down, I would make the argument that Iranians overall are unlikely to blame the United States, but that they would blame specifically the Rouhani government. When Rouhani became president, even before he became president, during his campaign, he made a lot of promises to the Iranian people. He promised an improvement in the economy and greater social freedoms. He promised media freedom in Iran, or greater media freedom, the release of political prisoners, Iran's decreasing international isolation. And when we look at Rouhani's record, objectively, he hasn't really accomplished any of those things. He signed the JPOA, the Joint Plan of Action, and Iran has seriously engaged the international community in the negotiations, and it should be commended for that. But in terms of its domestic policies, the human rights situation in Iran and the lack of personal freedoms are as bad as they have ever been. And so there's a very high expectation among Iranians for the Rouhani government to deliver. And when you talk to people who travel to Iran, especially Tehran, they say life is still very difficult in Iran. Despite some of the economic improvements, there is a lot of unhappiness, that the middle class is being virtually wiped out because of sanctions and the overall economic situation, and that Iranians want major change. And so when we look at Rouhani's major constituency within Iran, they still want a nuclear deal. And some people are arguing that, well, Iranians will not accept a very severe cut in the number of centrifuges, that they will see this as a national humiliation. While I would argue that the Iranian regime at the very top levels, including Khamenei, feels this way, I doubt that Iranians care that much about uranium enrichment, that they're willing to see their livelihoods endangered because of a few thousand centrifuges here and there. Ultimately, the international community expects Iran to make concessions on the nuclear program. The P5+1 has already implicitly recognized Iran's ability to enrich uranium, and the onus is on the Iranian government to prove that its nuclear intentions are entirely peaceful. So, in conclusion, I still think that the United States and the P5+1 have a lot of leverage on the nuclear negotiations. I do believe that the Rouhani government and his team want a nuclear deal, that they're even willing to be more flexible, that they let on in public because they want a better economy, they want an Iran that's not so internationally isolated, they want an Iran that plays a role in the region. But ultimately, Rouhani and Zarif, don't make the final decisions. When you look at Khamenei's infographic, one of the things he says is that only the Iranian foreign minister, Zarif, is allowed to make a nuclear deal and engage in negotiations. And of course, Zarif reports to Khamenei, and there's really no mention of Iran's President Rouhani. And ultimately, I think if anybody sinks a nuclear deal, it will be the supreme leader. While Zarif and Rouhani, I think, have a different agenda that I believe they're more worldly. They've lived in the West, they're Western educated, they speak English. Khamenei's calculations are very different, that he's very concerned with ultimately his political authority, that he doesn't want to look weak on the nuclear issue, and ultimately the supreme leader and the conservative establishment are the impediment to a final deal on the nuclear issue. Having said all of that, I don't think a nuclear deal is impossible. I still think there's enough pressure on Iran that it will come to the table and consider negotiations even more seriously than before. Because when you look at this situation, there's really no exit for Iran. It will remain under sanctions and under international pressure if there's no nuclear deal. And ultimately, I think Iran needs its petrodollars more than uranium. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ali.
So thanks to the Arms Control Association for having me here, and thank you, Kelsey, for the introduction. I'm going to talk about three things. The first is the sanctions that are in place today. The second is the mechanisms for some immediate relief under a potential deal. And third, the options for more comprehensive structural economic relief for Iran down the road. So first, the measures in place today. There are US, EU, UN sanctions. There are also sanctions in place against Iran by a number of other countries, independent jurisdictions, and they're aimed at isolating Iran diplomatically and economically, both to halt some of the activity of concern that has been identified publicly, and also to create leverage for diplomatic negotiations. So I'm not going to go into the economic effectiveness of these sanctions. We've heard that referenced by some of my fellow panelists. There are 4 UN Security Council resolutions that deal with Iran, and they aim to address concerns of Iran's nuclear activities, ballistic missiles, conventional arms. They talk about the IRGC, deceptive financial practices. They're not we should think about these UNSCRs not so narrowly on particular nuclear issues or technical procurement activities. In fact, they have grown to include a slightly broader universe of activities of concern. They freeze assets, impose travel bans and on many named entities, and call on UN member states to enhance due diligence in addressing these activities or actors of concern that are named. So most of the international sanctions and most of the most powerful economically sanctions are US sanctions on Iran. The European Council also has put in place a number of powerful sanctions, which are thematically quite similar to US sanctions, and they involve many of the same entities. They're not as broad-ranging, and they're not in the extent of those named, and to the secondary nature or extraterritorial nature such that the United States sanctions are. In the United States, our sanctions regime I would call comprehensive and strategic, but not necessarily systematic. There's no single umbrella legal authority that organizes these sanctions. It's an awfully interconnected web. There are 10 congressional statutes. These are pieces of legislation passed by Congress. There are 26 EOs, all dealing with Iran in some way. Those are executive orders put in place by the administration. There are also export controls. There's a 30-year-old that are maintained by the Commerce Department, a 30-year-old trade embargo. This is all to say that it's quite extensive. There are lots of authorities. They have been put in place over many decades. They also cover a variety of Iranian activities of concern, just as the UN does, but much broader. Proliferation, of course, terrorism, human rights violations, regional destabilization. And we heard briefly about the, of course, in the P5+1 and Iran's interim agreement, under the Joint Plan of Action, Iran received relief from sanctions. They are, of course, this entire regime remains in place. And the relief that has been granted, I would certainly call marginal, probably hasn't even lived up to what was promised on paper, which is not surprising if you think about the cautiousness that the international community has when dealing with Iran, particularly the international banking community. But the relief that was offered by both the US and the EU rolled back some of the auto, petrochemical, precious metals sanctions. Also, it committed to no new nuclear sanctions, although certainly there has been enforcement of existing nuclear sanctions during this period. It offered Iran $4.2 billion in access to its funds held in escrow abroad under the first interim agreement, and then another 2.8 under this extension, this 4-month extension. And there's some other, significantly, provisions that allow Iran to keep selling the amount of oil it had been selling before this agreement went into place. So that's supposed to be in the neighborhood of 1 million barrels per day. It has been a little bit more than that. And detail folks can argue about whether or not that's legitimate or not. There's some ambiguity in the way the sanctions are written around condensate, a kind of light, high-quality oil, which actually seems to not be constrained in the same way that other oil has been. So turning now to mechanisms for immediate relief for Iran under a potential deal scenario. The fastest, easiest options to deliver relief, even quite a lot of economic relief for Iran at the beginning of a potential nuclear deal, come directly from the US administration and from the EU Council. So first on the process for such relief. We understand from the negotiators, the P5+1, that this will come in stages. It will be reciprocal, that is to say, offered in response to concessions on the part of Iran. And it will also be coordinated internationally, and that's not just good for signaling and international unity, it's also necessary for clarity for the private sector internationally, which will struggle to figure out exactly how to put this in place in practice. The US administration has quite a lot of flexibility all unto itself to offer immediate and independent sanctions relief. It doesn't need Congress, as was mentioned. Even while a number of the sanctions authorities that the US administration uses were put in place by Congress. So there are waivers in a number of those pieces of legislation put in place, sanctions legislation put in place by Congress. They are temporary and renewable national security or national interest waivers. And that is how, the use of such waivers is how the administration gave Iran its relief during this joint plan of action, and how it would be able to give Iran access to more than 100 billion of its foreign exchange reserves that are held abroad in escrow. There are other ways that the administration can offer relief using flexibility that it has in a regulatory sense in understanding terms like significant transaction or significant reduction, and then with its own executive orders, these independent authorities that have been put in place by the administration that are used so often by the administration. These are discretionary by nature, and there are opportunities through license and new executive orders that the administration has to roll them back and create more relief there. So everything I've just talked about is a way to lift or suspend the application of implementation, but not to remove sanctions, such as those written into law by Congress. But as I certainly agree with what Bob has said, it's not, removing them isn't necessary to create sanctions relief, even very extensive and long-lasting relief. And one of the reasons why people are so concerned about the removal of sanctions is because they seek to create permanent and irreversible relief for Iran in order to have a strong bargaining chip to get similarly permanent and irreversible nuclear concessions from Iran. But I would challenge anyone who thinks that there's anything such as permanent sanctions relief. It doesn't exist. They can be reimposed basically with the stroke of a pen. It might be a little more logistical doing when it comes to Congress, but we have in fact seen in the relatively recent past sanctions, massive sanctions programs, such as the one for Libya in 2011, put in place almost overnight that have been very painful economically and comprehensive. So a focus on permanence here, I think, is missing the point of the way these authorities work in practice. EU sanctions are relatively easy to roll back mechanically. The Council of the European Union needs to decide and formalize in its process. The UN process is a little bit harder for logistical and political coordination reasons, and I'll come back to that in a second. So on substance of sanctions relief, of course, the P5+1 is focusing on nuclear-related sanctions, as we heard, and so concerns related to terrorism, nuclear activities, won't be rolled back. So all of the sanctions that exist in the United States, for example, that deal with those kind of concerns when it comes to Iran, they're not on the table. And it's important to know that in practical terms, they cover a variety of financial institutions in Iran and sectors of the economy. So it's not so neat. It won't be so neat to think about rolling back certain sanctions and that frees up, say, an entire sector of the economy or their entire banking system when there are concerns related to, say, terrorism in the banking sector. So for further relief down the road, this is the kind of larger sanctions relief that could come if Iran takes further sustained steps under a potential nuclear deal that are verified and there's enough confidence. So the administration, as I mentioned, in the flexibility that they have to offer relief, that they can create quite a lot of extensive relief, even structural, that will not just offer some of the cash injections or opportunities to expand trade, but to open up new investment opportunities and the kinds of economic changes that will set Iran on quite a different path economically to really grow its GDP and open up to the international community. What could this involve? This is not just, from a technical perspective, the use of insurance, vessels, trade financing, ports, shipping and banking services. It's also this new investment, massive new investment by foreign companies, and dialing back or removing sanctions on Iran's banking sector, including, of course, its central bank. So Congress can act, as we've discussed previously a little bit, to affirm or recognize a deal and sanctions relief offered in a deal, but it doesn't have to. However, if it does, this would look like a new piece of legislation that would amend some of those statutes in place, the Iran Sanctions Act or the another very significant one passed in the end of 2011 that governed sanctions on Iran's energy exports and central bank. If Congress does act, though, it will need to move exactly in parallel to the relief that is offered in a potential deal or risk undermining it. And that's because if it sets up different standards, even if an if clause, if Iran doesn't manage to comply with the verification regime and the concessions that it must comply with under a deal, such potential sanctions could be held out as an option. It will create a good amount of uncertainty in the international community, the banking community in particular, such that they will be hesitant to in fact, move forward with new business opportunities available to them. So it will mean that sanctions relief offered on paper won't match sanctions relief that occurs in practice. And that's a very significant problem for the P5+1 in thinking about their credibility in offering their side of the deal. So from the EU, as I mentioned, it's not very challenging. It's not as technically challenging for them to offer sanctions relief. I think for the EU to turn off its sanctions on that free central bank assets of Iran would make quite a significant change for Iran. Also, the sanctions it has on the SWIFT system, the international payment messaging system, out of which most Iranian banks have been shut. And on the UN, let me just say briefly that, so we know that there's a very significant interest amongst the Iranian parties to the negotiation to see relief from these sanctions. There will be this will be a process, I think, that necessarily will happen in stages after very public and transparent processes for verification that Iran has complied with its side of a potential deal. And that those steps for verification will have to be laid out in a new UNSCR, Security Council resolution, that will make clear exactly what the process will look like and what will be removed, and deal with the fact that there are concerns in some of those 4 existing Iranian Security Council resolutions that I think won't be dealt with in this in a potential nuclear deal. So let me just sum up and say I think that sanctions relief is technically feasible. It's legally challenging for the crew of lawyers that has to figure out exactly what this looks like in practice between waivers and licenses and the like. But it's not impossible, and it can be done even in very large amounts in the immediate future. It will be incremental based on a track record of compliance. It will also be coordinated internationally by necessity for the sake of aligning on paper and in practice sanctions relief. And even under a best case scenario, there's still going to be an awful lot of concern from the private sector and sanctions that remain in place. So I haven't talked at all about what tougher sanctions on Iran could look like, to either as passed by Congress and what that might do to the negotiations, although I certainly would like to associate myself with the comments Bob made about how that would complicate and perhaps permanently derail these negotiations, nor what they would do to Iran's economy, though I can do that in the Q&A session if folks are interested. So we'll stop there. Yeah.
Well, thanks to our panelists sticking to the speaking time, we have a good half an hour for questions. So I will recognize you. Please wait for the mic and introduce yourself, and please ask a question and not deliver a comment. So Sherman, we'll start with Laura Rosen in the center table.
Thank you for doing this, and it was an excellent presentation. Bob, reports in the past day from Iran say that the Iranian negotiators have testified to members of the Iranian parliament that the U.S. has moved in their direction a little bit on centrifuges, and the number in the reports today were 4,000. So one, can you speak to that? We've seen reports in the press that the U.S. had moved a little bit in their direction. Have you heard of any narrowing? You know, and would you see that as a sign of them trying to sell the deal at home, that, trying to make the case the U.S. has moved in their direction? And Alireza, on the question of whether Iran has overestimated its leverage in the negotiations, even Rouhani last month in New York reiterated that when he spoke to Obama on the phone last year, he had proposed and Obama agreed to do the nuclear deal first before talk of any type of cooperation regionally. And he's emphasizing again that he's not looking for the U.S. to work with Iran versus ISIS before a nuclear deal, but that's the sequence that was. So speak to what seems a kind of contradiction on the Iranian side about what they can get. Thanks.
Great. Bob, should we start with you?
Laura, on the 4,000, I'm not privy to the details of what may have been said, especially in the session that involved only 3 individuals, Secretary, Foreign Minister of Iran, and Cathy Ashton. But I would be skeptical about the 4,000 number. I think there are some in the P5+1 that would like to see the U.S. move from 1,500 up until to that range, and maybe those who support that kind of flexibility would be the source of that kind of information. But I'm not aware of any movement in a formal sense from the 1,500.
So on the issue of Iran's regional role, I think when it comes to nuclear negotiations, fundamentally the problem is that the United States is negotiating with multiple people and multiple power centers, some of which are not at the table. So whereas the Rouhani government says that it wants to keep aside the nuclear issue or separate the nuclear issue from regional issues. Other members of the Iranian elite, especially within the security establishment, may not view that approach as being very effective. Of course, Rouhani even himself has said, along with Zarif, that Iran can play a very big role in the region, and this could help its nuclear position. But I think they're facing a lot of pressure from Khamenei, the Revolutionary Guards. In recent days, Iranian media had been very quiet about the role of the Revolutionary Guards in Iraq and Syria. Now it's, they're very proud of it. There are pictures of Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force, walking around with Iraqi soldiers and generals. And so they're really playing that up. And so I think, that part of the establishment sees Iran's regional role as increasing its leverage potentially. And I think when it comes down to fundamentally, the centrist groups in Iran, like Rouhani, have a very different vision of foreign policy and Iran's role, not just in the Middle East, but with the rest of the world than people like Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards. And I think that's also part of the problem that infects nuclear negotiations quite heavily. So the calculations are very different.
Thank you. Shervin, let's come down here and this gentleman in the front. Yes, in the front here.
Thank you. My name is Carlo Trezza from Italy. I have a question for Bob Einhorn. I have the sense that, as you say, the gap, that the central issue is the issue of the number of the centrifuge. And there the gap seems to be enormous because the present number of centrifuges doesn't make sense from an energy point of view. They would need much more in order to be useful for, let's say, to nourish the Bushehr power plant. And I am afraid that this gap is so big that it cannot be filled. So I wonder if an alternative approach to the number of a centrifuge wouldn't be to base the negotiation on the stocks of fuel. And after all, why not encourage the Iranians to maybe have more, but to burn it as much as possible in their power plants? Is that a possibility?
Thank you.
Carlo, the Iranians have very unrealistic notions of their actual needs for enriched uranium. In the near term, they only have a practical need to provide fuel for 1 or 2 research reactors, which require a small fraction of the enriched uranium required by power reactors. The Iranians could accept the U.S. numbers and still be able to meet their realistic near-term needs, and at the same time extend their fuel supply contract with the Russians to acquire enough enriched uranium to fuel the Bushehr power reactor. So for some considerable period of time, they could achieve all of their civil nuclear energy goals by accepting the U.S. proposal. But they, for whatever reason, national pride, dignity, whatever it is, they don't want to do that. So now, in terms of stocks, yes, there's a trade-off between the number and type of centrifuges on the one hand and the question of stocks. And if you reduce stocks, you can perhaps permit a somewhat greater number of centrifuges. But even if the Iranians reduce their low-enriched uranium stocks to 0, then to have a sufficiently long breakout time, they would still have to come down significantly in the number of centrifuges. So I think, stocks is a key element of it. The Iranians seem inclined to want to reduce stocks, perhaps even by exporting some of the the material. But I think they're still going to have to decide that they can meet their civil nuclear requirements with a smaller number of centrifuges for a substantial period of time. Now, one of the elements of the deal is that after the expiration of the comprehensive agreement, all bets are off. They would, any special restrictions that applied during the duration of the agreement would be gone. And so if after, say, 15 years or 20 years, they wanted to ratchet up and produce power reactor fuel indigenously, they could do that. So my own view is we shouldn't require the Iranians to abandon their ambitious and I believe unrealistic nuclear energy plans, but they simply have to defer those plans. Take the time, 15 years, whatever, extend their fuel supply contract with Russia, acquire the fuel they need for a robust nuclear power program, and do the work they need to get themselves in a position to produce fuel indigenously. But they don't need to do that for the near term.
Thank you. Carlo, I would also draw your attention to a report that the Arms Control Association worked on with the International Crisis Group that looks at a combination of factors on the uranium enrichment issue, and including sort of balancing centrifuges and stockpile. And we should have copies available out there. But more questions. It looks like we have two in the front. Let's take David Culp and this lady right here.
David Culp with the Quakers. Bob, you gave a pretty grim assessment on what happens on November 24th. About then, Congress will also come back into session. And there'll be calls from some members to impose crippling sanctions, that's the phrase that's used, to try to force additional concessions out of the Iranians. In the opinion of the panelists, what would be the impact of a new round of sanctions that were passed by the Congress after November 24th? And the phrase that's used repeatedly is crippling sanctions. Would that be a beneficial impact or put things back?
Thank you, David. Let's take a second question here. Shervin, thank you.
Hi, I'm Nancy Gallagher from the University of Maryland, and I've got a question particularly for Ali Nader. You made a number of statements about Iranian, both public opinion and elite opinion, and my research center recently did an opinion survey with the University of Tehran and asked basically a number of questions that get right to the kinds of things that you were making statements about, perceptions of the economy, perceptions of sanction, perceptions of the nuclear program, acceptability of a variety of different measures, and who they would blame if the negotiations failed. And I would say that on pretty much every single one of the points that you mentioned, our findings were very different. Now, you can argue about how accurate public opinion polling is in Iran, either because the public's not well informed or they're not telling you the truth. I would say that in the poll we did on Iran, they were actually better informed on the nuclear negotiations than Americans were. And there's no reason to believe that people aren't giving us a reasonably straightforward opinion, because everything they were saying was basically consistent with what the Iranian government has done so far. So my question for you is, what happens if your assessment of Iranian opinion and internal dynamics is wrong?
Great. Thank you, Nancy. Let's start with the sanctions question first. Liz, Bob, if both of you might want to share your thoughts on that.
Sure. So right now, the crippling sanctions that are proposed come in the form of the Kirk-Menendez bill, the centerpiece of which would be to remove Iranians' oil exports on the market down to zero over a period of time, which is painful for Iran, not just because this is a major revenue stream, but also because as oil prices are sinking and have been sinking, it's getting a lot less than it might have anticipated otherwise at this time. So this is a major source of revenue that's going away even faster than the impact of which would be felt even more aggressively than it would if oil prices were at the higher band that they have been over the last several years. So implications in two parts, for the negotiations and then also for the private sector. So I certainly think that this is a deal breaker for the negotiations. It's painful economically for the Iranians. It also makes the United States, of course, look like a an actor negotiating in bad faith and can't manage to keep its Congress from changing the goalposts, if you will, in this negotiation and making the punishment or the pain look a lot worse than it does now. For the private sector, in responding to these sanctions, there's already quite a lot of anxiety about doing business with Iran and getting caught wrong side of the sanctions and the penalties that would occur, in addition to the reputational harm that may exist for any private sector company. So having this out there as even as a threat is of great concern. Having it out there on the books would be fatal for economic relief for Iran. Even legitimate business activity that is permitted with Iran, humanitarian trade, for example, or some of the kinds of business opportunities that were opened up under the Joint Plan of Action haven't occurred because there aren't banks or companies willing to wade in and try and do even legitimate business. And this would chill that environment quite considerably further.
Let me just say, I was involved in trying to build international support for the oil sanctions a few years ago, and we were able to be incredibly successful in persuading countries like China and India and Japan, South Korea, Turkey, to reduce very substantially their imports of Iranian crude oil. And the reason we could be successful, not only because we were so persuasive in our argumentation, but because there were alternate sources of supply. The Saudis were prepared to increase their production. At that time, Iraqi crude was coming onto the market. Libyan crude was coming onto the market. North American crude was entering the market. So countries like China, which are huge consumers of Iranian crude, were able to shift to these alternate suppliers to the point that oil revenues received by Iran were down by more than 50, almost 60%. Which is where they're at, basically now. But a number of these countries have informed the U.S. that essentially they're done, that they're no longer the excess supplies in the market. It would be harder for them to continue to shift away from Iranian crude. So if there was legislation that essentially said, we will sanction you unless you go down to zero in your imports of Iranian crude, I think it may be very difficult to get international support for that. And we would be in a very difficult position if there were new, strong legislated sanctions and we were unable to deliver. I mean, if the negotiations break down, immediately there will begin the blame game. Who is responsible for the failure? And the Iranians, who are very good at public diplomacy, will make the case that the U.S. was the intransigent side. The U.S. will make the opposite case. But we would get ourselves into a very difficult situation with the Iranians calling on countries like China and India and Japan and South Korea to relax the sanctions. And it's not clear that we would be able to ratchet them up to the point where they would be crippling on the Iranian economy. So I think, best to avoid that kind of a situation and to continue the negotiations beyond November 24th, if necessary, but without the imposition of additional sanctions. I think the existing sanctions already provide sufficient incentive to the Iranians to continue to negotiate seriously. As long as the existing sanctions are in place, rational Iranians understand that they can never make their economy right. And so they will continue to have incentive to get the current sanctions lifted.
Ali, if you'd like to speak to Nancy's question.
Sure, and I think that's a great question. It's a very fair question. My question to you is, how did you conduct your poll? Was it in person or over the phone?
It was over the phone.
All right. So there are two parts to my answer. Number one is the question, how much does Iranian public opinion really matter on this issue? Because Iran is not a democratic country. So yes, President Rouhani must answer to the Iranian people. The Supreme Leader does not have to answer to the Iranian people. He's not elected by them. He's not accountable to them. His position is for life. No matter what happens, he'll be the supreme leader. There won't be another election that will remove him from power. So his calculations are different. And a lot of Khamenei supporters within the system say that public opinion doesn't matter at all. It doesn't matter what Iranians think because the supreme leader is appointed by God. He's responsible to God, full stop. So public opinion in Iran matters, but not as much as we think. On the issue of public opinion surveys, I would say conducting surveys in authoritarian countries like Iran is highly problematic. And I conducted a poll in Iran in 2009 through the RAND Corporation. We called 1,000 Iranians, talked to them on the phone. A lot of what they said was in line with what the Iranian government thought about the issues. Surprisingly, a lot of Iranians, I think the majority, were opposed to ties with the United States, which I find very hard to believe. There was high support for the nuclear program. But also, when you conduct interviews on the phone, people are nervous. Iranians believe that the government listens on all their phone calls. And the Iranian government does. It monitors their phone calls, monitors their email, their use of the internet, their use of the social media. You know, in the past few months, we've seen Iranians who use social media to express themselves. For example, the Happy group that made the video, they're arrested, they're put in jail, they're never heard from again. So when we did our survey in 2009, a lot of Iranians were afraid to respond truthfully and honestly. And if I weren't in Iran and somebody called me and asked me those questions, I would be afraid to answer honestly as well. So I think doing public opinion surveys in Iran is very problematic, especially on the phone. Now, if it was a more open country, if there wasn't a climate of fear, if the government didn't monopolize the information environment in Iran, if you could go house to house and interview people in person, I might give a different answer. But the reality is that I as an analyst, don't take public opinion polls, including my own, too seriously.
I just follow up that and say, but what if the public opinion polling is actually telling us something worth knowing?
I mean, the question is, look, Iranians support the nuclear program, right? They believe that Iran has a right to advanced scientific knowledge and technology. A lot of Iranians might even tell you Iran should have nuclear weapons. You know, Israel has nuclear weapons and Pakistan has nuclear weapons. The United States has nuclear weapons, so why shouldn't Iran have nuclear weapons? But I think the costs are so high in terms of, especially the economic costs. I just don't believe that the average Iranian would support the nuclear program over economic issues, over bread and butter issues, because I just don't think the average person really cares about the nuclear program that much. The average person wants to have a job, to be able to put their kids in school. So that is not the most prominent issue. You know, for Ayatollah Khamenei, that's an existential issue. He's staked his reputation, his power on the nuclear issue, and he can't appear weak on the issue. But we can't assume just because a tiny minority of Iran's political elite think about the nuclear issue that way that the entire population thinks the same way.
Thank you, Ali. We have time for a few more quick questions. Jonah, let's go to the back here. There are two gentlemen at this back table, Ed Levine and then the gentleman sitting behind him.
Edward Levine, retired from the Foreign Relations Committee staff. I wonder, in the event of an agreement, how do you see the role of the IAEA, not only in verification, but in bestowing a seal of approval on Iranian behavior?
Larry Weiler. I wonder if Bob Einhorn would address the issue of, will the question of past activities of the Iranians be a sleeper issue? Now, I can see the negotiators dealing with it, but you're talking now about the honor of the state, and I wonder if the Supreme Leader would veto any action at all attempting to deal with this? Do you just forget it and go on, or what?
Great, thank you. Bob, if you'd like to start.
Yeah. Obviously, Ed, the IAEA's role will be critical in monitoring any agreement. I think the hardest thing is going to be the issue that Larry just raised, the possible military dimensions of the program, the past nuclear activities. If there's an agreement, a comprehensive agreement reached, I don't think the IAEA will, at that point, have resolved its concerns about these past activities. So I think what would have to happen is that certain sanctions easing measures would have to be withheld and await the IAEA certification at a later date that these issues had been resolved. I don't think the P5+1 would come to an agreement if Iran continues to stonewall on these PMD issues. But if they're in the process of resolving them, I think the sensible course would be to withhold certain sanctions easing measures until these concerns are fully resolved. Now, Larry, it's very difficult to resolve these issues because you have the supreme leader having issued a religious decree, a fatwa, against the acquisition, possession of nuclear weapons. So how can Iran then admit that it was engaged in research activities directly related to development of nuclear weapons? This is going to be very difficult. Governments aren't very good at making confessions of past sins. And I don't think we can expect Iran to be fully transparent about past activities. I don't think they have to be fully transparent, but I think they have to be transparent enough so that the international community has confidence that these activities have stopped, and there would be a basis to determine whether they had been resumed. I think the focus needs to be forward and to making sure these activities don't recur in the future, rather than to understand every detail about past activities.
Unfortunately, we have to wrap up this panel, but thank you all for your excellent questions. It will be a very interesting month leading up to November 24th. And please join me again in thanking our panelists for their excellent presentations. Thank you.
Nice meeting you.